Welcome back in. Today we're going to be talking about our must-start plays at every position. We're going to go through quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end to get you ready for your Week 10 matchups. Let's go ahead and get to it. We're going to start with the quarterback position. We're going to start with my favorite quarterback play of the week, and that is Justin Herbert versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. After a 5-game stretch of averaging 16.6 fantasy points per game, Herbert has bounced back the last 3 weeks, averaging 28.3 fantasy points per game. On the season, Herbert has the second most passing yards and touchdowns. He also ranks top 5 in deep ball attempts and red zone attempts. He currently ranks 5th in fantasy points per game, averaging nearly 22 points per game. On the ground, Herbert leads all quarterbacks with 305 rushing yards, but only has 1 rushing touchdown this season. The rushing yards have been a nice bonus and elevates his weekly floor. This week, though, the Chargers get a home matchup against the Steelers on Sunday Night Football. The Steelers have allowed 299 passing yards and 1.75 passing touchdowns per game to opposing quarterbacks. This has also led to them allowing the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Justin Herbert is a top 3 quarterback play for me. Let's move over to Jaxson Dart versus the Bears. It's taking over since week 4. Jaxson Dart has been one of the best fantasy quarterbacks, averaging 22.8 fantasy points per game. A lot of his production come on the ground in the 6 games as a starter. He already ranks 7th in rushing yards and has 5 rushing touchdowns, which trails only Josh Allen. Now, there certainly could be some improvement as a passer as well, as he ranks 19th in EPA per dropback and 29th in completion percentage. Now, we should take this into consideration that Dart has been without Malik Neighbors for most of his time as a starter, and Darius Slayton has also missed time as well. All things considered, he's been a huge hit as a fantasy quarterback, and we should be encouraged with him moving forward as a top 12 quarterback in future years. As far as this week is concerned, though, Dart heads to Chicago to take on a Bears defense that has been ravaged by injuries and just allowed Joe Flacco to throw for over 400 yards on the season. The Bears allow 250 passing yards and 2.5 passing touchdowns per game through the air to opposing quarterbacks. They've also struggled against mobile quarterbacks, allowing the 9th most rushing yards per game to the position. Overall, the Bears have allowed the 5th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, making Jaxson Dart a top 5 quarterback. Let's keep moving. Move over to Caleb Williams. It's been an up and down season for Caleb Williams. He's bounced back in a big way last week, throwing for 280 yards and 3 touchdowns, while also adding 53 rushing yards and catching a touchdown for 38.7 fantasy points against the Bengals. Well, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Williams completed just 58% of his passes. We are hardly going to complain about his day that he had as a whole. This week, the Bears welcome in a Giants defense that's allowed the 4th most passing yards, the 8th most touchdowns, and the 7th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Williams, once again, is a locked-in top 12 quarterback. The only concern would be if the Bears control this game and the Bears leaning heavily on their rushing attack. Let's keep moving here. Let's talk about a little bit more maybe streaming-type plays. But first up is going to be J.J. McCarthy for me. If you're looking for streaming options, J.J. McCarthy could be your man. Don't get me wrong. There's definitely some volatility here. He's been limited as a passer. He's averaged just 23 pass attempts at 145 passing yards per game. However, he has thrown 2 touchdowns in 2 of the 3 games. He also has 4 INTs. He has scored 20 fantasy points in 2 of his first 3 starts, though some of that is due to the rushing touchdowns. The Ravens defense has improved lately. Since their week 7 bye, they have yet to allow a passing touchdown, but have allowed over 270 passing yards per game to opposing quarterbacks. On the season, the Ravens still allow the 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. I think McCarthy is an intriguing fantasy play this week and does offer 20-point upside, but the downside is certainly here and something you should consider before firing him up. And then lastly, Michael Penix Jr. is next up for me. Penix has been another quarterback who has been wildly inconsistent this year. He currently has 3 games of producing top 12 numbers, but also has 4 games of being the QB 19 or worse. His biggest issue as a fantasy quarterback has been his lack of touchdowns. Now, the yardage totals have certainly been there, but however, his 3.4% touchdown rate ranks 25th among quarterbacks. So why play Michael Penix for starters? This game has a very healthy 48.5-point total, which is the 5th highest game on the slate. Secondly, this is a solid matchup. The Colts have allowed the 5th most passing yards, the 8th most touchdowns, and the 14th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. It does sound like Sauce Gardner has a chance to play this week, who was just acquired, but would still needs a clear concussion protocol. But I would think with a short turnaround plus a trip overseas, I would think that he would be very limited if he were to play this week. I do think Michael Penix is a borderline top 15 quarterback play for me this week. Let's move over to the running back position. We're going to start with Rico Dowdle versus the Saints. After 2 weeks of playing less than 50% of the snaps, Dowdle was reinserted as an every down back and was rewarded fantasy managers with another monster game. He carried the ball 25 times and brought in 2 of his 3 targets for 141 total yards and 2 scores for 28 PPR points. In games where Dowdle was played north of 50% of the snaps, he's averaging just over 30 PPR points on the season. He's been one of the most explosive running backs, averaging 5.2 yards per carry. He ranks 6th in explosive run rate, 15th in yards after contact per attempt, and 2nd in EPA per rush. Next up is a matchup against the Saints defense. Has allowed 110 rushing yards and nearly a touchdown per game, or the 10th most PPR points to opposing running backs. The Panthers are currently 5.5-point home favorites against the Saints. Dowdle should smash again this week. Let's move over to Quinshon Judkins versus the Jets. Now, we got a bit of a scare with Judkins before their week 9 bye with a shoulder injury. Well, good news. Judkins returned to practice on Monday, and it isn't even listed on the injury report on Wednesday. Judkins has been game script dependent this season, so it should help that the Browns are 2.5-point favorites against the Jets that have just unloaded 2 of their best defensive players in Quinnen Williams and Sauce Gardner. Judkins is averaging 17 carries and just 2.1 targets per game. He really hasn't been all that efficient with his touches, but as long as he keeps getting fed volume, he will be a viable fantasy asset on most weeks. And the Jets have allowed the 8th most rushing yards, the 12th most touchdowns, and the 12th most PPR points to running back season. And that was prior to losing Quinnen Williams. Judkins should be a very strong RB1 play this week. Let's keep it moving. And we're going to move over to Jaylen Warren versus the Chargers. Jaylen Warren continues to be a late round steal this year. He continues to see 14.1 carries and 3.4 targets per game. He also ranks 13th in red zone touches. It's 14.1 PPR points per game, ranks 17th. He's been okay on a per touch basis on the ground, but continues to shine through the air, ranking 7th in yards per reception and 6th in yards per route run. If you're simply going to look at fantasy points allowed per game to running backs, the Chargers allowed the 18th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. However, if you dig a bit deeper, you should see that they have been much worse than that on a per touch basis. The Chargers currently allow the 5th most yards per carry at a clip of 5 yards per carry per game, as well as the 5th most rushing touchdowns. The reason why it appears on the surface that they are better against running backs is due to only seeing the 4th fewest rushing attempts so far this year, which has more to do with the game scripts they've seen. The Chargers opened up as 4.5-point favorites, but that total has dropped down to 3 points in a matter of a few days. Translation, fire up Jaylen Warren as a top 20 running back play this week. Move over to Bears running back DeAndre Swift. Swift missed last week with an injury, but he returned on Wednesday to practice, which is great news, and signed for his Week 10 availability. Swift has quietly been a top 12 running back, averaging 15.9 PPR points per game. He's owned 14.3 carries and 3.4 targets, as well as 70% of the opportunities. On the ground, he ranks 9th in yards after contact per attempt, 4th in explosive run rate, and 28th in missed tackles forced per attempt. Through the air, he's received a healthy 11% target share and ranks 4th in yards per reception and 9th in yards per route run. I do think Kyle Monangai likely gets a bit more work, but Swift should still see enough work to make him a solid RB2 with RB1 upside, especially in a matchup against the Giants, who have allowed the 2nd most rushing yards, the 5th most rushing touchdowns, the 9th most receptions, the 10th most receiving yards, and the 3rd most receiving touchdowns. All go to 2nd most PPR points to running back. So it's a phenomenal matchup for both of these guys. But DeAndre Swift is a solid RB2 play. Let's keep moving. We're going to talk about Kenneth Walker versus the Cardinals. It's been a gross year for Kenneth Walker. He's currently the RB28, averaging 10.4 PPR. While he certainly hasn't met expectations, it's not because he's been bad. He currently ranks 8th in explosive run rate, 9th in missed tackles forced per attempt, and 4th in elusive rating. Now, none of those things score fantasy points, but the main issue here has been his lack of usage inside the 10-yard line. We have seen time and time again this year, Zach Charbonnet coming in and steal touchdowns away, severely limited his upside. However, maybe we finally have seen a change in his usage coming out of their Week 8 bye. Last week, Walker played a season-high 57% of the snaps. He also saw 4 touches inside the 10 compared to just 1 for Charbonnet. Walker also ran a season-high 50% of his routes. Hopefully, if this trend continues, we will see a second-half breakout for Kenneth Walker. As far as this week is concerned, the Seahawks get a home matchup against the Cardinals. The last time these two teams played, Walker totaled over 110 total yards, but lost touchdowns to Zach Charbonnet. Surprise, surprise. The Cardinals have struggled to bottle up opposing running backs lately, allowing a 5.2 yards per carry to running backs over the last 4 games, and they have allowed the 16th most fantasy points to opposing running backs on the year. Walker is a low-end RB2, mostly to the unknown, if last week was a 1-week blip or a sign of things to come. Now let's move over to some more flex options. First I want to hit on is Aaron Jones, who looks really good last week against the Lions, totaling 98 yards on 11 touches before he left with a shoulder injury. Aaron Jones did say after the game that he was fine and expects to play against the Ravens, though he did not practice today. But I will say Wednesday practice reports aren't really that important, especially for veterans. As long as he's able to go, he's a low-end RB2 against the Ravens that have allowed the 6th most PPR points to running backs. But this is definitely a situation we're going to need to monitor this week. Next up, let's talk about the Giants running backs. Last week was pretty frustrating from a usage standpoint for Tyrone Tracy. In Week 8, after Cam Scotty went down, Tracy played 62% of the snaps against Philly. Then in Week 9 against the 49ers, it fell to 44% of the snaps and just 5 carries. it was at least encouraging to see he still ran 50% of the routes. The question moving forward is Devin Singletary the lead back, or was this just a 1 week deal? I will say I think both are viable flex options this week against a Bears defense that has multiple injuries along their defensive front and have allowed the 12th most PPR points to running backs. So I do think both of these guys are in play this week. Obviously, I think they're capped right now if this is going to be a committee, but I still think Tyrone, Tracy, and Devin Singletary are both players you can look at to fire up in your flexes. Keep moving. Let's talk about Kyle Monangai. Even with DeAndre Swift returning, I think Monangai has earned more work moving forward. Swift has never been a bell cow in his career. It's really hard to ignore the 198 total yards he put up, even if it was against the Bengals. Prior to Swift's absence, Monangai played 45% of the snaps and total 15 and 8 touches against the Saints and Ravens. Meaning Monangai should still be a top 30 running back this week against one of the worst run defenses in the league. Lastly, let's hit on RJ Harvey. This is a volatile play. Harvey has put up top 10 performances in each of the last 2 weeks against the Cowboys and Texans. In week 8, he had 8 total touches for 51 yards and 3 touchdowns for 24 PPR points. And then last week, he had 2 carries, but he had 5 receptions on 5 targets for 56 yards and another score for 16 PPR points. Snap share, though, remained at just 28%, so there is a definite volatility here. However, in a matchup against the Raiders, where the Broncos are 9.5-point favorites, we should see another 8 to 10 touches for Harvey, making him a very viable flex play. Now let's move over to the wide receivers. We're going to start with Garrett Wilson versus the Browns. Like he'll be returning this week after returning to practice on Wednesday. Despite how bad the Jets' passing game has been this year, Wilson has overcome that with averaging 16.6 fantasy points per game, which ranks top 8 among wide receivers. The volume has also been a big factor here. His 34.8% target share is the second highest rate for any wide receiver, and his whopping 48.3% first read target share is the highest rate for any wide receiver this season. He's also been efficient with his targets, averaging 2.32 yards per team pass attempt, which also ranks top 10. Next up for Wilson will be a matchup against the Cleveland Browns. The Browns have been a pass funnel this season. The Browns allowed the 6th most fantasy points to outside wide receivers and have allowed the 7th most touchdowns to wide receivers this year. Wilson is a high-end wide receiver 2 for me this week. Let's keep moving. Let's move over to Nico Collins. Now, first off, CJ Stroud has already been ruled out for this game, and we're going to be getting a full game of Davis Mills. Now, on one hand, Davis Mills is awful. We know this. He absolutely peppered Nico with 10 targets last week. Davis Mills took over in the second quarter after Stroud was knocked out with a concussion. Mills went on with 10 of his 11 targets. With Mills, he had 6 catches for 66 yards. This was also against one of the best defenses in the league in the Broncos. Now, this week against the Jaguars, this is a much easier matchup. The Jaguars have allowed the 6th most touchdowns and the 11th most PPR points to opposing wide receivers. While I have no faith in Davis Mills, I do think this matchup sets up really well for Nico. And I think he can at least be viewed as a middle-of-the-road wide receiver 2 this week. Move over to Jauan Jennings. Jauan Jennings had a bit of a bounce-back game last week against the Giants. He finished with 4 catches on 5 targets for 41 yards and a touchdown. He finished with 14.1 PPR points, or wide receiver 26 on the week. Obviously, nothing major, but considering the fact that this was the first game since week 2 of him scoring more than 8.5 PPR points, we'll definitely take it. Jennings is a lone wide receiver still standing, with Ricky Pearsall still nursing a PCL strain, and Brandon Ayuk still recovering from his injury last year. Jennings should be in line to see 6 to 8 targets most weeks, and this week sets up nicely for Jennings to keep the good times rolling. The 49ers will take on the 49ers will take on the Rams for the second time this year. Jennings missed the last time these 2 teams squared off. Schematically, this sets up really well for Jennings. The Rams have allowed the 3rd most PPR points to outside wide receivers. Jennings only runs 26% of his routes from the slot. So this matchup sets up really well, making him a low-end wide receiver 2 play for me this week. Let's keep moving over to Troy Franklin. It's been an extremely up and down year for Franklin. But one thing that's certain has been his usage. He currently ranks top 16 in targets with a 21% target share. He also ranks 6th in deep targets and 4th in red zone targets. He's currently wide receiver 38, averaging 11.6 PPR points per game. One reason I love Franklin this week is the perfect schematic matchup. Franklin runs 48% of his routes from the slot, which was top 7 among wide receivers. The Raiders have struggled mightily against slot wide receivers this season, allowing the 4th most PPR points from the slot. Overall, the Raiders allow the 5th most PPR points to Franklin is a strong wide receiver 3 play for me this week. Keep moving here. Let's move over to Darius Slayton. I'm not really sure if I'm in the minority here, but I still prefer Darius Slayton to Wan'Dale Robinson. Slayton sees more of the high-value touches, while Wan'Dale Robinson is more of a volume-driven, as all of his targets 10 yards of the line of scrimmage, and that is being generous, opposed to Slayton, who has a very healthy 13.7 ADOT, which ranks top 15. Slayton last week against the 49ers secured 5 of 7 targets for 62 yards, 11.2 PPR points. The Bears are a very good matchup as well. The Bears have allowed the most receptions of 20-plus yards, and their 7.4 yards per attempt also ranks second, which better suits Darius Slayton's role in this offense. Fire up Slayton is a strong wide receiver 3 play for me this week. Go over to some flex plays. Let's talk first about Tez Johnson. Chris Godwin looks like he's going to miss at least another week, which opens things up for Tez Johnson. Johnson has been targeted 15 times the last 2 games before their bye. He's also running about 85% of the routes, 35% of his routes from the slot. While this isn't a perfect matchup, Tez will avoid the Christian Gonzalez matchup, making him a viable flex play this week. Next up, let's talk about Alec Pierce. The Falcons defense has been very good against slot wide receivers this year. They have allowed the 6th fewest PPR points to the position, which makes me less excited to play Josh Downs and more likely to play Alec Pierce. Pierce is fresh off his 13-target game where he hauled in 6 of them for 115 yards and 17.5 PPR points. Over his last 3 games, he's been targeted 28 times, and he has surpassed 70 yards in all 3 of them as well. Pierce is a strong wide receiver 4 play. Lastly, let's talk about Christian Watson. I think Watson is in play against the Eagles. Matthew Golden is dealing with a shoulder injury. Tucker Kraft is out for the year with an ACL. And Jaden Reed continues to be out. Packers tend to spread the ball around, but with so many weapons out, Watson makes for an intriguing play against the Eagles, who allow the eighth most fantasy points to opposing wide receiver. Watson is a borderline top 36 wide receiver for me. Now let's move over to tight ends. And we're going to talk about one of the obvious ones. I still want to bring him up, and that's Oronde Gadsden. He's now posted tight end 1 score in 4 straight games. He's running nearly 100% of the routes and has been a top 5 tight end over the last month. Gadsden ranks 4th in yards for a route run, 8th in yards for team pass attempt, 4th in yards for reception, and he already ranks top 10 in deep targets and red zone targets. We are absolutely firing up Gadsden again this week as he gets one of the best matchups on the slate. The Steelers allow the 3rd most PPR points. Next up after that is going to be Kyle Pitts versus the Colts. Kyle Pitts has been a tight end 1 through 9 weeks of the season. He currently ranks 5th in targets and sports the 4th highest target share. He's currently running a route on 93% of dropbacks, which ranks top 3. We would love to see more touchdowns from Kyle Pitts, but that's also just a product of Michael Penix, who only has 8 passing touchdowns all year. Either way, Kyle Pitts has been a very solid tight end play on most weeks, and the power of friendship shines through. As Penix said in training camp, that is BFF and wants to get him going this season. Next up is an awesome matchup against the Colts, who allowed the 4th most PPR points to tight ends. Move over to Colston Loveland. The Colston Loveland breakout finally happened last week against the Bengals. Last week, he hauled in 6 of 7 targets for 118 yards and 2 scores for 29 PPR points. For a little reference, Loveland scored a total of 22 PPR points in his first 7 games. It was also encouraging to see that he ran 89% of the routes and played 81% of the snaps. Cole Kmet also figures to be out again this week after suffering a concussion last week against the Bengals. Loveland is a tight end 1 play for me. And then let's move over to Theo Johnson. Theo Johnson was targeted 6 times last week, and he hauled in 3 of them for 27 yards and a touchdown for 12 PPR points. Theo will continue to be a viable option with his red zone usage. He ranks top 5 among tight ends and red zone targets this season and also ranks 8th in route participation. This is a very solid matchup for Johnson as the Bears allow the 10th most PPR points to tight ends. And lastly, Jauan Johnson versus the Panthers. With Rashid Shaheed gone, more targets should continue to flow towards Jauan Johnson. Johnson's having a breakout year, scoring just under 10 PPR points per game. He ranks 6th in receptions, 8th in receiving yards. He's also been a safety blanket for his quarterback this season, as he has drawn a first read target on 22% of dropback, which also ranks top 4 among tight ends. Next up for Johnson is a good matchup against the Panthers, who will have the 12th most PPR points tight end. So that being said, if you have any questions, whether it's rosters, trades, whatever you have, leave them in the comment section below. Be sure to get to them. Let's get some dubs this week. We're getting closer and closer to the fantasy playoffs. We'll see you on the next one. Bye.